before the first city, before the first king, before the wheel, the written word, the planted field, the fired pot. Before any of the things we use to mark the beginning of civilization, there was stone, and someone was shaping it. Not chipping flint for an arrowhead, not grinding rock into a hand tool, not scraping a hide clean for the coming winter. Someone was carving enormous limestone pillars into T-shapes taller than a man, decorating them with images of foxes and vultures and scorpions and snakes, and setting them in careful circles in the ground on a hilltop in what is now southern Turkey. Someone was building something that had no obvious practical purpose. No grain storage, no shelter from the rain, no defensive wall against an enemy, but that required the coordination of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people working together over long periods of time. Someone was building something that looked, from the outside, very much like a temple. This was happening 12,000 years ago. The people who built it left no writing, no city, no pottery, no evidence of farming. Older models of human history did not expect them to be capable of organized, large-scale construction. And yet the stones are there. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, the name means roughly Potbelly Hill, a plain name for what has turned out to be one of the most consequential archaeological discoveries of the last century. It sits on a ridge in the Taurus Mountains near the city of Sanliurfa, surrounded by the dry limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia. For most of human memory, it was just a hill. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd noticed something unusual on the surface of the ground. A large flat stone partly exposed by erosion, shaped in a way that did not look natural. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived the following year, looked at what the shepherd had found, and understood that this was not a medieval cemetery, not a Byzantine structure, not anything that any previous account of the region had prepared him for. He spent the rest of his life excavating it. Imagine standing on that ridge at dawn. The plateau stretches away in every direction, pale limestone under a pale sky. The air is dry and still. And there, emerging from the earth before you, the tops of enormous carved pillars rise from the ground. Ancient, deliberate, patient. You are looking at one of the oldest known places of its kind ever made by human hands. What Schmidt found has forced a quiet, sustained revision of one of the most fundamental assumptions in the study of human history. The conventional story places complexity after agriculture, temples after cities, organized religion after organized food production. Göbekli Tepe places a temple before all of it. Whatever the people who built it believed, they believed it strongly enough to move mountains for it. And that, more than any detail of the archaeology, is what makes this place so difficult to set aside. The region surrounding Göbekli Tepe has been inhabited by human beings for hundreds of thousands of years. The limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia was home to Paleolithic hunters long before the Neolithic Revolution began, and the specific spot on which Göbekli Tepe was built was not chosen at random. The ridge commands a wide view of the surrounding landscape, visible from a great distance and itself able to see far in every direction. In many prehistoric cultures, hilltops carry cosmological significance. They are closer to the sky, they stand at the threshold between the human world below and whatever powers inhabit the world above, they are natural gathering places that draw the eye and orient the territory around them. Before Schmidt arrived, the site had been noted by archaeologists surveying the region in the 1960s, but it had been dismissed as a medieval site on the basis of a brief surface inspection. The systematic bias toward identifying the familiar and dismissing the anomalous is a recurring feature of archaeological history, and it is one of the reasons that sites as significant as Göbekli Tepe can sit unrecognized for decades while scholars walk past them. Schmidt's willingness to look seriously at what the shepherd had found, to resist the temptation to file it under a familiar category and move on, was the beginning of everything that followed. In the years after his first visit, he would return season after season, slowly uncovering the circles of stone that had been sleeping under the plateau for 12 millennia, each season adding depth to a picture that kept growing stranger and more significant the longer he looked at it. In the years that followed Schmidt's first season, the site expanded in every direction. Each enclosure that was uncovered added new evidence, new questions, new complications. The sheer density of the carved imagery was unlike anything previously known from this period. The precision of the construction was unlike anything previously known from this period. And the date, confirmed by radiocarbon analysis of organic material found in the fill, by the stratigraphy of the layers, by the typology of the tools found in association with the structures, was earlier than anything the existing models could comfortably accommodate. Göbekli Tepe was not just old. It was old in a way that required rethinking what old meant for the purposes of understanding human history. The conventional account of the beginning of civilization runs something like this. For most of human prehistory, people lived in small, mobile bands, following animals, gathering plants, camping in caves or temporary shelters. Then, approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. People in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East began deliberately planting and harvesting crops. They domesticated animals. They built permanent settlements. With permanent settlements came stored food, and with stored food came surplus, and with surplus came specialization, and with specialization came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came the conditions for everything else we recognize as civilization. Cities, temples, writing, law, art, trade, war. The agricultural revolution, on this account, was the engine that drove everything that followed. Farming came first. Complexity came after. This account is elegant. It is logically satisfying. It fits the assumption that material conditions drive cultural development, that people build temples only after they have enough to eat and enough time to think about something other than survival. It was, for much of the 20th century, the dominant framework in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, and it shaped not just scholarly interpretation but the broader cultural understanding of human origins that most educated people carry with them. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this sequence. The structure is older than agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years, and possibly several thousand. The people who built it were, as best we can determine from the available evidence, still primarily hunters and gatherers. They were not farming the hilltop. They were not living there permanently. They came to the hill to build and to gather and to perform whatever rituals the place was built to contain. And then they left, and they came back, and they built more. The implications are considerable. If complex ritual construction preceded settled agriculture, then the standard sequence of cultural evolution needs to be reordered, or at least seriously complicated. The question is not simply which came first, the temple or the farm. The question is what the relationship between them was, and whether the construction of shared symbolic space was itself one of the pressures that pushed people towards sustained, concentrated food production. Klaus Schmidt spent years thinking about this, and he arrived at a hypothesis that has become one of the most debated in the study of human origins. Not that farming created temples, but that temples created the conditions for farming. The need to feed the large gatherings of people required to build and maintain a site like Göbekli Tepe may have been one of the pressures that pushed communities toward the deliberate cultivation of wild cereals. The temple, on this account, came before the city, and may have been the reason the city eventually appeared. The specific feedback loop that Schmidt proposed between ritual gathering and agricultural development is difficult to test directly, but it is consistent with what we know about the relationship between large-scale social gatherings and resource management in other contexts. When large numbers of people gather regularly in one place, the area around that place needs to produce food in quantities that exceed what opportunistic foraging can reliably supply. The pressure to intensify food production in the vicinity of an important gathering site could have pushed communities toward cultivation long before a full agricultural system was established. Feasting and building may have been intertwined activities from the beginning. What this sequence implies is a world that was already more organized, more symbolically sophisticated, and more capable of sustained collective action than the conventional picture of pre-agricultural humanity suggested. The hunters and gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe were not the scattered, isolated, hand-to-mouth foragers of a certain popular imagination. They were people with the capacity to sustain a shared project across generations, to coordinate the labor of many hundreds of individuals, to feed those individuals in large gatherings on a hilltop in the dry Anatolian summer. They were people, in other words, who had already solved some of the hardest organizational problems that civilization is supposed to have solved. The challenge that Göbekli Tepe poses to the conventional story is therefore not simply a matter of sequence, of which came first, the temple or the farm. It is a challenge to the underlying assumption about what hunter-gatherers were capable of, about the nature of the cognitive and social threshold that separates the pre-agricultural world from the civilized one. The threshold, if there is one, was crossed much earlier than we thought, and perhaps in a place and for reasons that have nothing to do with the practical economics of food production. To stand at Göbekli Tepe and look at the enclosures is to feel the weight of time in a very specific way. The T-shaped pillars, massive limestone slabs, some of them weighing 10 to 20 tons, shaped into a distinctive cross-section that most archaeologists interpret as a highly stylized representation of the human form, with the horizontal bar representing shoulders and head, stand in concentric circles, the largest in the center, the smaller ones arranged around them. The circles are not uniform. They vary in size and orientation, and the specific arrangement of pillars within each enclosure differs from the others. This variation suggests that the enclosures were not built according to a single fixed plan but were added and modified over many generations, each new construction reflecting the decisions and the needs of the people who made it. The imagery carved into the pillars is dense and varied. Animals dominate: foxes, boars, gazelles, aurochs, cranes, vultures, ducks, scorpions, snakes, spiders. The representations range from simple reliefs to fully three-dimensional carvings. Some animals are shown singly, in profile, with a quality of observation that suggests long familiarity with the specific behavior and physical character of the species represented. Others are shown in clusters or in motion, their bodies intertwined in ways that suggest narrative or symbolic significance rather than simple decoration. On the two central pillars of Enclosure D, the largest and most elaborate of the excavated structures, the human-like quality of the T-form is made more explicit by the addition of carved arms, hands, and a belt at the waist. These pillars are not simply abstract forms. They are figures, beings of some kind, facing each other across the center of the enclosure. Whatever ceremonies or gatherings happened in this space happened between these watching figures and beneath their gaze. Close your eyes for a moment and try to reconstruct it. The enclosure at night, torchlight moving across the carved reliefs, the fox frozen mid-stride, the vulture with its wings half spread, the great central figures looming in the shadows above. A gathering of people around a fire, the sound of the plateau wind, the smell of burning wood and roasted meat. Whatever was said here, whatever was performed here, it was important enough to carve in stone and keep. The scale of the enclosures varies. The earliest are also the largest. The great circles of Enclosure D, in the lower layers of the site, have central pillars that stand over 5 meters tall. Later enclosures, built in the upper layers as the site developed over centuries, are smaller and show some stylistic evolution in the carved imagery. The sequence from large to small is counterintuitive if we think of a community gradually gaining resources and ambition, but it is consistent with the possibility that the site's function changed over time, that the enormous communal gatherings of the earliest period gave way to smaller, more specialized ritual uses as the broader cultural context shifted. The question of what the enclosures were used for remains genuinely open. The absence of residential debris, cooking hearths, sleeping areas, domestic refuse, makes a purely domestic interpretation unlikely. The specific imagery of the pillars, dominated by wild animals and by forms that suggest a boundary between the human and the animal world, points toward ritual use. Many archaeologists have proposed that these were spaces for feasting, for initiation, for funerary rites, for the management of the symbolic dimensions of life in ways that required a dedicated space separate from the everyday. The carved imagery extends below the ground surface. Some of the pillars have carvings on their lower sections, in the parts that would have been visible only before the enclosures were filled with the accumulated debris of use. This suggests that the decoration was complete from the beginning, comprehensive rather than merely displayed in the visible portions. The makers cared about the whole object, not just the parts that others could see. The orientation of the enclosures is another point of active research. Some of the structures appear to be oriented toward specific astronomical phenomena: solstice sunrises, the rising of particular stars, the position of the moon at specific times of year. If these orientations were intentional, they would suggest a sophisticated knowledge of astronomical cycles among the builders, and a desire to embed that knowledge in the built environment in a way that made certain moments in the year visible and meaningful. The connection between ancient monuments and astronomical observation is well established at many later sites, and it would be surprising if the people who built Göbekli Tepe, who were clearly capable of sophisticated planning and symbolic thought, had not also attended to the sky. The headless human figures that appear in the imagery at Göbekli Tepe are among the most discussed of the carved scenes. Several of the pillars show partial human figures without heads, in contexts sometimes associated with vultures carrying heads away, or with scenes that suggest ritual treatment of the dead. These images, combined with the prevalence of vulture imagery, suggest a specific and well-developed set of beliefs about death, the fate of the body, and the relationship between the head and the identity of the deceased. The head, in this symbolic world, was clearly significant in ways that went beyond the anatomical. The question of how Göbekli Tepe was built is at least as interesting as the question of what it was for. The limestone for the pillars was quarried from the bedrock of the plateau, less than half a kilometer from the main site. The quarrying required tools, flint picks, hammers, levers, but no metal, no wheel, no domesticated draft animal. The same stone tools available to hunter-gatherers throughout the Upper Paleolithic were, in combination with human muscle, human ingenuity, and human cooperation, sufficient to extract and shape limestone blocks weighing many tons. There are unfinished pillars still in the quarry, abandoned mid-extraction, that allow archaeologists to reconstruct the sequence of operations. First the outline was cut into the bedrock, then the sides were worked down, then the underside was gradually freed until the pillar could be levered out and dragged on timber sledges to the construction site. The dragging alone was a massive undertaking. Experimental archaeology has shown that moving a 10-ton limestone block across uneven terrain without wheeled vehicles requires teams of many dozens of workers, careful organization of labor, and sustained effort over many hours or days. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, across a construction history that spans at least 1,000 years, represent a level of social organization that is simply not compatible with the image of scattered, independent bands of hunter-gatherers meeting occasionally and then dispersing. The people who built Göbekli Tepe must have had mechanisms for gathering large numbers of people, for coordinating their labor over extended periods, for feeding and sustaining them during the construction process, and for transmitting the knowledge of how to continue the work from one generation to the next. They must have had leaders, or something that functioned like leadership. They must have had a shared symbolic framework, a shared understanding of what the place meant and why it was worth building, that was compelling enough to motivate sustained collective effort. All of this had to exist before farming. It could not have been a product of civilization. It was, in some sense, the beginning of it. The problem of feeding the workforce is one of the most practically significant puzzles in the archaeology of Göbekli Tepe. The faunal assemblages from the site include large quantities of bones from wild animals, particularly gazelles and aurochs, suggesting that organized hunting on a large scale was part of the economic system that supported the site. Some researchers have proposed that the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe coincided with the seasonal migrations of large animal herds through the region, and that the hunters who came to participate in the construction were also taking advantage of the same season's hunting opportunities. Feasting and building may have been intertwined activities, the communal meal a central part of the communal construction event. The cumulative labor investment across the full history of the site runs to millions of person days. This is not work that can be done by a small band in the gaps between hunting and gathering. It requires a much larger labor force, sustained over a long period, organized by something more structured than the flexible arrangements of the mobile band. Whatever that structure was, it existed here, on this limestone ridge 12,000 years ago. The specific number of workers required for the construction of Göbekli Tepe has been estimated using the tools of experimental archaeology and labor economics. The extraction and transport of a single 10-ton pillar, based on experimental trials, requires approximately 500 person days of work. The erection of that pillar in its prepared stone socket, using levers, ramps, and ropes, requires additional labor on top of the quarrying and transport. Multiply this by the number of pillars in each enclosure, multiply again by the number of enclosures, and the cumulative labor investment across the full history of the site runs to millions of person days. The question of what organized that labor is one that the archaeology can only answer indirectly. The site has not yielded the kinds of evidence that archaeologists typically use to identify hierarchical social structures. There are no obvious elite residences, no clearly differentiated burials with rich grave goods, no administrative records. But the labor required to build the site is itself evidence of organizational capacity, regardless of what specific form that organization took. Whatever the social structure of the builders was, it was capable of mobilizing and directing large amounts of labor toward a shared goal. That is a significant achievement, and it happened 12,000 years before the first writing system was invented to record it. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous of a growing family of sites in the same region, and the family is still expanding. Karahan Tepe, located approximately 35 kilometers to the east, was known to archaeologists for decades but was only systematically excavated beginning in 2019. What excavators found was a site of comparable age and architectural sophistication to Göbekli Tepe, but with significant differences in style and content that make it clear these were not copies of the same template but independent expressions of a shared cultural tradition. At Karahan Tepe, the T-shaped pillars appear embedded in carved stone benches that line the walls of the excavated structures, creating an arrangement that feels almost theatrical, as if the stone figures were seated in rows, facing inward, attending something. The human-like quality of the pillars is even more emphasized here than at Göbekli Tepe. Some have realistic carved human heads at the top of the T-bar, with detailed facial features, suggesting an explicit connection between the stone figures and human identity. Taz Tepeler, Stone Hills in Turkish, has become the collective designation for this cluster of pre-pottery Neolithic sites in southeastern Anatolia. It now includes more than a dozen known sites, several of them excavated or partially excavated, with more likely to be identified as survey work continues. These sites share certain architectural features: the T-shaped pillar, the circular or oval enclosure, the absence of domestic occupation, and certain iconographic elements, particularly the repertoire of carved animals. But they also differ from each other in ways that suggest independent creative traditions working within a shared symbolic framework. The implication is that what we are seeing at Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly. We are seeing one node in a network of ritual sites distributed across a significant stretch of territory and persisting for a very long time. The civilization implied by this network was not a city-state, not a kingdom, not anything that corresponds to our usual categories of political organization. It was something more diffuse, more distributed, more oriented around shared symbolic practice than around territorial control. But it was a civilization, in the sense that matters most, a community of people sharing a world of meaning. The specific connections between the Taz Tepeler sites are an area of active investigation. Obsidian found at Göbekli Tepe has been traced to volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away. The movement of obsidian implies the movement of people, or at least the maintenance of exchange networks that connected communities across significant distances. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were also participants in these exchange networks, then their world was larger than the hilltop, connected to a much wider geography through the flow of materials and, presumably, of people and ideas. The world of the Taz Tepeler was a world of movement, connection, and shared symbolic investment, sustained across a large territory and a very long time. Understanding it requires letting go of the assumption that civilization requires concentration in a single place. The question of pilgrimage is one that some archaeologists have raised in this context. If Göbekli Tepe and the other Taz Tepeler sites were important enough to attract workers from across a wide region, and the obsidian finds suggest that people were moving across significant distances, then the act of traveling to the site to participate in its construction or its rituals would have been a meaningful journey, a pilgrimage in the broad sense of a purposeful movement toward a place of special significance. The idea of pilgrimage as a social practice that connects dispersed communities and reinforces shared identity is well established in later religious history, and it may have roots in exactly this kind of pre-pottery Neolithic gathering culture. The biological and genetic evidence is beginning to add texture to the picture that archaeology has drawn. Ancient DNA studies of skeletal remains from pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the greater Middle East are revealing patterns of population movement, mixing, and separation that can be compared with the archaeological evidence for cultural connections. The emerging picture is one of a dynamic, mobile, interconnected world, not the static, isolated, small-band world of the older textbooks, in which people moved, met, exchanged mates, exchanged goods, and exchanged ideas across distances of hundreds of kilometers. Göbekli Tepe was embedded in that world, a significant node in a network whose full extent is only now beginning to come into focus. There is something both humbling and clarifying about this scale. The world before cities was not a world of people doing less. It was a world of people doing differently, organizing themselves around different priorities, constructing different kinds of shared meaning, investing their collective labor in different kinds of monuments. The results were different from what the cities would later produce. They were not smaller. 12,000 years of stone circles on a plateau is not a small achievement. It is simply a different kind of achievement from the pyramid or the cathedral or the skyscraper, one that lasted, and one that we are only now, at this particular moment in history, beginning to be able to see. The animals carved on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe were not random. The selection, dominated by foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions, and boars, does not correspond to the animals that were most important as food sources. Gazelles were far more significant in the diet, based on the faunal remains found at the site, than the animal imagery on the pillars would suggest. The carved animals were not there to celebrate the hunt, at least not primarily. They were there for other reasons. One prominent interpretation focuses on the symbolic or cosmological significance of the specific animals chosen. Vultures, in particular, appear in a context that many archaeologists associate with death and with the processing of the dead. In some later Anatolian and Near Eastern cultures, excarnation, The exposure of the dead to vultures as a means of removing the flesh from the bones was a documented funerary practice. The famous shrine room at Catalhoyuk has wall paintings showing vultures interacting with headless human figures, in a scene that most researchers interpret as a representation of funerary excarnation. If a similar practice was associated with the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the prominence of vulture imagery might represent the agency of the bird as a messenger between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Snakes and scorpions carry a more ambiguous symbolic charge. In many ancient cultures, they are associated with danger, transformation, and the liminal space between the tame and the wild, between the human and the inhuman. Their presence on the pillars, often in large numbers and in dynamic positions, suggests that the builders were engaged with these symbolic associations, that the decorated enclosures were spaces where the categories of the human world were held up against the powers of a wider, wilder reality. The specific animals absent from the carved repertoire are also informative. Domesticated animals are entirely absent, consistent with the hunting and gathering economy of the builders, but perhaps also a deliberate symbolic choice. The enclosures were spaces for wild power, for the undomesticated, for the forces that existed beyond human control. What was being engaged with here was precisely the wild, the ungovernable, the dangerous, the powerful, in a ritual context that may have been about establishing a specific relationship between the human community and the forces that surrounded it. On certain days, when the excavation trenches are quiet, the plateau carries a silence that feels earned. The stone pillars stand in their enclosures, still wearing the animal images their makers carved 12,000 years ago. The fox still runs. The vulture still waits. Whatever it all meant, it has outlasted everything that surrounded it. The fox is the most common animal in the carved repertoire at Göbekli Tepe, and the fox's significance in the symbolic world of the pre-pottery Neolithic is not well understood. Foxes appear in quantity at several other sites in the region, including in contexts that suggest deliberate deposition. The placement of fox remains in specific locations as a symbolic act rather than as food refuse. They may have represented a class of spiritual or cosmological power that was important in the belief system of the builders, a power that the specific imagery of the pillars was intended to invoke, contain, or honor. The symbolic repertoire of Göbekli Tepe connects it to a broader tradition of animal symbolism that runs through the pre-pottery Neolithic world and into the later cultures that succeeded it. The specific animals shift over time and across space. The fox gives way to the bull, the vulture to the eagle, the scorpion to the serpent, but the underlying orientation toward the animal world as a source of symbolic power and cosmological significance persists. We are not separate from this tradition. The animals that populate our mythologies, our heraldry, our religious imagery, our dreams, carry traces of the same fundamental orientation toward the non-human world that the carvers of Göbekli Tepe were expressing in limestone 12,000 years ago. The imagery of the pillars also speaks to the specific ecology of the region and the role that certain species played in the lives and imaginations of the people who lived there. The gazelle, so abundant in the diet, is largely absent from the carvings. The aurochs, enormous, dangerous, the ancestor of domestic cattle, appears frequently. The contrast suggests that the carved animals were not chosen for their practical importance but for their symbolic weight. The things that mattered most in the everyday economy of survival did not necessarily matter most in the economy of meaning. The people of Göbekli Tepe distinguished between the world of necessity and the world of significance, and they built their enclosures to honor the latter. There is a patience to the stone that is difficult to describe and easy to feel. 12,000 years is long enough that the context of the carvings has been entirely lost, long enough that the language in which their meaning was communicated has vanished completely, long enough that the specific rituals, the specific beliefs, the specific cosmological framework that gave these images their significance are beyond recovery. What remains is the quality of the attention that went into making them. The fox is not casually scratched. The vulture is not approximate. Someone looked very carefully at these animals over a very long time, and then translated that looking into stone with a precision and a care that are still visible 12,000 years later. Whatever they were doing here, they were doing it seriously. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe is one of the most discussed and most mysterious facts about the site. Sometime around 9,000 years ago, approximately 3,000 years after the first construction began, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were filled in. Not collapsed, not abandoned to the slow accumulation of debris. Deliberately, systematically filled in with flint tools, animal bones, and limestone rubble, and then covered with a thick layer of soil. The filling was thorough enough that the site became a low mound of undifferentiated debris that looked, from the surface, like nothing more than a slightly irregular hilltop. The deliberate nature of the filling is established by the character of the deposits. They are not random accumulations, but mixed fills that include material from multiple contexts, suggesting an intentional process of collection and deposition. The animal bones in the fill are primarily from wild species, and many are from the parts of animals typically discarded after butchering, which may indicate that the material came from feasting deposits, the remnants of large communal meals associated with the ritual use of the site. Why would the people who had invested so much labor in building the enclosures bury them? This question has attracted speculation that ranges from the mundane to the profound. One possibility is that the burial was a form of ritual closure, that the enclosures had fulfilled their purpose and were being respectfully decommissioned, sealed in the same way that a sacred object might be ritually buried when it is no longer in use rather than simply discarded. Another possibility is that the burial was connected to a broader cultural shift, perhaps the transition toward agricultural life, in which the specific symbolic world that Göbekli Tepe embodied was becoming less central to the community's identity. The old powers were being put to rest. A third possibility is that the burial was protective, that the enclosures and their contents were being preserved intentionally, sealed against damage or desecration. On this interpretation, the burial was not an ending but a form of careful keeping, a recognition that what had been built mattered and should not simply be left to weather and erosion. The sheer scale of the filling operation adds weight to the sense of intentionality. Thousands of tons of material were moved into the enclosures over what appears to have been a relatively short period, an operation that required the same kind of organized collective labor that the original construction had demanded. This was not casual abandonment. It was a project completed by people who understood what they were covering and made a decision to cover it. Whatever the motive, the scale of the effort suggests that the ending of Göbekli Tepe, if it was an ending, was as deliberate as its beginning. We do not know which of these explanations is correct. We may never know. The people who filled in the enclosures left no written account of their reasons, and the archaeological evidence is consistent with more than one interpretation. What we can say is that the burial was deliberate, and that deliberate choices require reasons, even when those reasons are no longer recoverable. The material placed in the fill also provides some information about the context of the burial. The faunal remains are dominated by wild species, suggesting that the people who filled the enclosures were still primarily hunters, or that the material came from a hunting-based feasting tradition rather than a farming one. The tools included in the fill are consistent with the pre-pottery Neolithic toolkit. This suggests that the burial occurred before the full agricultural transition, while the builder's world was still in some ways continuous with the world in which Göbekli Tepe had been built. The ending came from within, not from outside. The ending was not a catastrophe. It was a transition. And transitions, in human history, often look like endings from the inside and like beginnings from the outside. The people who lived through the shift from the world of Göbekli Tepe to the world of the early farming village did not know they were crossing a threshold. They were making practical decisions about food, about land, about children, about the management of increasingly large and complicated communities. The symbolic world they had been building and maintaining was not something they set aside deliberately. It transformed slowly, as the conditions of life transformed, keeping some things and losing others, and gradually becoming something different enough to look, from the outside of 12,000 years, like a different world entirely. The people who participated in the burial of Göbekli Tepe were, in some important sense, the same people who had built it, not the same individuals, obviously, since 3,000 years had passed between the first construction and the final filling, but the same cultural tradition, the same symbolic world, the same set of concerns about the relationship between the living and the dead, the human and the animal, the made and the unmade. They knew what they were covering. They may have had stories about it, oral traditions that preserved some memory of what the enclosures had meant to the generations who first built and used them. We cannot know. But they chose to cover it carefully, thoroughly, with materials that would preserve it, and the preservation has turned out to be nearly perfect. The stones they buried are in better condition today than almost any above-ground monument of comparable age. Whatever the reason for the burial, the effect has been a gift to the future. The world before cities was not Göbekli Tepe alone. Across the same plateau and the broader Near East, other communities were building their own versions of a complex symbolic life, different in form, but shaped by the same deep human impulse. Çatalhöyük sits on the Konya Plain in central Turkey, approximately 500 kilometers west of Göbekli Tepe, and it raises questions of a different kind. It was a large, densely populated settlement, home at its peak to perhaps 8,000 people, and it was occupied continuously for approximately 1,000 years, from around 7,500 to 5,700 BCE. It has been studied intensively since its first excavation in the 1960s. And yet certain things about how its inhabitants lived remain genuinely puzzling. There were no streets. The houses of Çatalhöyük were packed together so densely, sharing walls on all sides, that the settlement had no open circulation space between them. Movement through the settlement was accomplished across the flat rooftops, and entry into each house was through a hole in the roof, down a wooden ladder to the interior below. The houses were not aligned in rows or organized around a central plaza. They were built up against each other like cells in a honeycomb, each one complete and independent, each one accessed from above. The houses were also, in a way that is unusual even for early Neolithic settlements, places of the dead. The residents of Çatalhöyük buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, under the sleeping platforms, under the hearths, under the areas where daily life continued above. A single house might contain the remains of many generations of residents, interred below the living floor in a continuous accumulation of ancestral presence. The house was not just a dwelling. It was a relationship between the living and the dead that was quite literally architectural, built into the structure of the floor itself. This practice of keeping the dead within the domestic space connects to the same set of concerns visible at Göbekli Tepe: the management of the relationship between the living and the ancestral, the maintenance of symbolic continuity across generations. The specific forms are different. The underlying impulse is the same. Before cities, before writing, before any of the institutional structures we normally associate with organized religion, human communities were already doing this, building and maintaining relationships with what came before them, in stone, in plaster, in bone. When a house at Çatalhöyük was demolished and rebuilt, the new structure was typically built directly on top of the old one, preserving the footprint and, with it, the accumulated ancestral deposits beneath the floor. Over generations, this process produced buildings that were multi-layered, each layer corresponding to a period of occupation. The house was not just a shelter for the living. It was a monument to the dead, continuously extended and renewed but never abandoned, as long as the lineage that defined it continued. The specific evidence for the house as a locus of ritual practice at Çatalhöyük goes beyond the burials and the wall paintings. The hearths of the houses appear to have had symbolic significance beyond their practical function. The placement of specific objects in and around the hearths, animal bones, worked flint, occasionally human remains, suggests that the fire itself was a meaningful presence, not simply a tool for warmth and food preparation. The maintenance of the fire, the rituals of its lighting and its tending, may have been part of a broader set of domestic practices through which the household managed its relationships with the cosmological forces understood to inhabit or influence the house. What Çatalhöyük shows us, when we stand back and look at it in relation to Göbekli Tepe, is that the symbolic complexity of the pre-pottery Neolithic was not confined to a single hilltop in southeastern Anatolia. It was expressed differently in different places, in public ritual enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, in the intimate domestic space of the house at Çatalhöyük, but it was sustained, across a broad territory and a very long time, by communities that understood themselves to be living in a world charged with significance. This is the world before cities. It was already full. The specific architectural innovations of Çatalhöyük, the rooftop entry, the shared walls, the absence of streets, created a social environment very different from the ones we normally associate with early urban life. There was no public space in the usual sense. There was no marketplace, no temple precinct, no palace or administrative center. The community was organized horizontally rather than vertically, each household complete in itself, none obviously dominant over the others. This is a form of urban organization that is, in some respects, more radical than anything the later cities produced. A large, dense, permanent community organized without hierarchy, without public monumentality, without the specialized spaces that most civilizations used to mark the distinctions between sacred and secular, between rulers and ruled, between the community and the individual. Whether this was a deliberate social choice or simply a practical solution to the problem of organizing a large number of people on a small area of productive land is unclear. What is clear is that it worked for 1,000 years. The walls of the houses at Çatalhöyük were covered with paintings. Not all the houses, and not continuously. The paintings were applied in layers, with each layer plastered over and a new one applied, so that the walls of a single house might contain dozens of successive painted surfaces. The content of the paintings varied. Geometric patterns, hands, animal figures, scenes involving human figures interacting with large animals. Some paintings appear to have been created for specific occasions, applied to a freshly plastered wall and then covered over again within a short time. Others were renewed repeatedly, suggesting that certain imagery held special significance worth maintaining. One of the most famous images from Çatalhöyük is a painting that has been interpreted as an early landscape image, a schematic aerial view of the settlement itself, with the blocky shapes of houses arranged across the lower part of the image and, in the upper portion, what appears to be a volcanic mountain in eruption. If this interpretation is correct, the image shows the twin-peaked volcano Hasan Dağ, which overlooks the Konya Plain from the south and which was volcanically active during the Neolithic period. It would represent an extraordinary early instance of the human impulse to document the landscape in which one lives. Other researchers have challenged this interpretation, suggesting that the lower portion may represent a leopard skin pattern rather than a settlement plan. The debate illustrates a broader challenge in interpreting prehistoric imagery. We are trying to read a visual language for which we do not have a key. The animal imagery at Çatalhöyük is dominated by large, powerful, dangerous species: aurochs, leopards, bears. In several rooms, the plastered skulls of aurochs, the massive wild cattle that were the dominant large mammal of the region, were mounted on the walls, with the horns projecting outward into the room's interior. These were not simply decorative trophies. They were powerful presences, incorporated into the living space in a way that made the interior of the house a place where the power of the wild animal was physically present, contained within the domestic space but not tamed by it. The leopard imagery at Çatalhöyük is particularly striking. In several painted scenes, human figures are shown wearing leopard skins, a posture that in many cultures represents the assumption of the animal's power by a ritual practitioner, a crossing of the boundary between species that is dangerous and transformative. If this interpretation is correct, the wall paintings preserve evidence for ritual specialists who mediated between the human world and the animal world, playing an important social and cosmological role. The symbolic world of Çatalhöyük and the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe are different in many of their specifics, but both are oriented toward the same horizon: the wild, the powerful, the forces that exist at the edge of the human community and define its boundaries. The practice of plastering and repainting the walls may itself carry interpretive significance. The successive layers of painted plaster, each one covering the previous, suggest that the visual content of the walls was not meant to be permanent, that the act of creating the imagery mattered as much as, or more than, the preservation of the specific images created. If the paintings were renewed seasonally, or associated with specific life events, or created as part of ritual processes that required their subsequent concealment, then the surface at any given moment was less important than the sequence of surfaces, the ongoing practice of image-making as a form of participation in the life of the house. This interpretive possibility is consistent with what is known about the renewal practices at Çatalhöyük more broadly. The plastering of walls, the whitening of floors, the regular replacement of the clay coating that covered surfaces throughout the house, all of these practices suggest a concept of renewal that went beyond practical hygiene. The house was periodically refreshed, its surfaces renewed, its accumulated residues covered over with clean white plaster. This refreshing may have had ritual as well as practical dimensions, marking the house as a space maintained in a specific state of readiness for the activities, including the symbolic activities of image-making and ancestor-keeping that were conducted within it. The aurochs skulls mounted on the walls of certain rooms at Çatalhöyük add to this picture of a domestic space that was also a ritual space. The aurochs was the largest and most dangerous wild animal in the region, the ancestor of domestic cattle, but vastly more powerful and threatening than any domesticated animal. The mounting of its horned skull on the wall of a living space was an act of bringing the most formidable expression of wild animal power into the most intimate human space. This was not decoration in any casual sense. It was a deliberate and probably ritually significant act of incorporation, a way of bringing the power of the wild into the domestic and containing it within the frame of human habitation, the same fundamental gesture that the great enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were performing on a much larger scale. At Jericho, hundreds of kilometers south of Göbekli Tepe in the Jordan Valley, a different kind of answer to the same question was taking shape, one built not from circular stone enclosures but from walls. Jericho is a name that most people know through the Bible, but its archaeological history reaches back long before any biblical narrative. The site of ancient Jericho, at Tel Es Sultan in the West Bank, is one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in the world. Human habitation at the site has been dated to approximately 11,000 years ago, contemporary with the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe. And what the first settlers built at Jericho, in that period before farming had fully established itself in the region, was a wall. The Jericho Wall dates to approximately 8000 BCE, a full 3,000 years before the walls of the biblical story. It is a substantial structure, a stone wall approximately 3 to 4 meters thick, and associated with it, a stone tower over 8 meters high, with an internal staircase of 22 steps cut from the living rock. This tower is one of the most remarkable constructions of the pre-pottery Neolithic, and the question of what it was for has occupied archaeologists for decades. The wall is easier to explain. Walls keep things out or keep things in. But the tower is harder. Its internal staircase is too narrow and too steep for effective military use. Its summit has no parapet or fighting platform. If it was a watchtower, it was an oddly designed one. Some researchers have suggested that it served a cosmological or ritual purpose, that it was a structure for watching the sky, for making something visible to the community, or for marking the community's relationship to the vertical dimension of the world in ways that were symbolically significant. The debate is ongoing, and the tower keeps its silence. What is clear is that the people of early Jericho were building on a scale that required coordinated community effort, investing significant resources in structures whose primary function was not simple domestic shelter, and doing this at a time when the Neolithic transformation was just beginning. Once again, the complexity appears to precede the conditions we normally assume it requires. This is the pattern that Göbekli Tepe established, and that site after site across the ancient Near East confirms. The human capacity for organized, symbolic, monumental action was present before the agricultural and urban revolutions that we once thought had created it. The site of Ain Ghazal, near modern Amman in Jordan, adds another dimension to this picture. Ain Ghazal was a large settlement by pre-pottery Neolithic standards, covering several hectares at its peak and probably housing several hundred people. It was occupied from approximately 7250 to 5000 BCE, a span of more than 2,000 years. What the evidence from Ain Ghazal adds, most importantly, is a sense of the social dynamics of early settled communities. The settlement grew over time, reached a peak, and then declined, and the decline appears to have been associated with environmental degradation, the overexploitation of the surrounding landscape as the growing population cleared forests, overgrazed pastures, and depleted the soil. The collapse of Ain Ghazal around 5000 BCE is one of the earliest documented examples of what we might call a sustainability crisis. A human community that had grown beyond the carrying capacity of its local environment and could not adapt quickly enough to prevent the decline of the system that supported it. The ancient world had limits. It encountered them early. The broader pattern of pre-pottery Neolithic settlement in the Jordan Valley and the surrounding hills reveals a world of considerable organizational sophistication. The communities that built and occupied these sites were not simply camped temporarily in convenient locations. They were managing territories, maintaining social relationships with neighboring communities, coordinating access to specific resources, and transmitting the knowledge of how to do all of this from one generation to the next. This is a complex social world, and it existed thousands of years before the urban revolution that is usually credited with creating the conditions for complex social organization. The specific landscape of the ancient Near East in this period was also significantly different from its current form. The climate of the pre-pottery Neolithic was somewhat wetter than today, particularly in the Levant and in the southern Anatolian plateau. The hills that now appear bare and rocky were covered with oak woodland. The valleys that are now dry were crossed by perennial streams. The animals that appear on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the aurochs, the gazelle, the red deer, were present in large numbers in a landscape that could support them. The people who built these sites were not scraping a living from a harsh and marginal environment. They were living in a productive landscape that rewarded the investment of organized effort. Ain Ghazal, near modern Amman in Jordan, preserves something that no other site from this period has yielded in comparable quantity or quality: the faces of the people who lived in the pre-pottery Neolithic world. Not photographs, not portraits in any realistic sense, but statues, 32 of them, found in 2 caches buried beneath the floor of the settlement, made from white plaster over a reed and cord armature, with inlaid eyes of bitumen and shell, standing or kneeling in poses of quiet presence. They are approximately human in proportion, though stylized and somewhat monumental in quality. The largest are close to a meter tall. Their faces have a quality that is difficult to describe precisely. Formal, calm, somewhat austere, but not blank. They seem to be looking at something, or for something. The Ain Ghazal statues are the largest known group of prehistoric statues in the world, dating to approximately 7200 BCE. They were not displayed in a public space or a temple. They were buried in caches that suggest they had served a specific purpose and were being preserved or decommissioned in a specific, careful way. Whether they represented ancestors, deities, spirits, or something else for which we have no equivalent category is unknown. But they represent people or beings that were important in a way we would struggle to articulate precisely. The technical skill involved in making them is remarkable. Working without metal tools, the artisans achieved a consistency of surface finish and anatomical proportion that testifies to significant experience with the medium. The white lime plaster was prepared from limestone burned at high temperatures, a process that required knowledge of kilning and fuel management well beyond simple improvisation. The inlaid eyes were carefully shaped and positioned to achieve a specific visual effect. These were not amateur productions. They were the work of specialists who had mastered a difficult medium. Taken together with the evidence from Göbekli Tepe, from Çatalhöyük, and from Jericho, the Ain Ghazal statues help fill in a picture of a world that was already doing what we typically reserve the word civilization to describe. It was creating shared symbolic spaces, producing art for purposes beyond decoration, building structures that required community organization, and maintaining a relationship with the dead that was at once intimate and formal. The question this world forces on us is not when civilization began. The question is what we thought civilization was. The discovery of the Ain Ghazal statues in 1983, during road construction near modern Amman, was one of those moments when the past appears suddenly and without warning from beneath the surface of the present. The construction crew uncovered the first cache of statues by accident, and archaeologists were called to the site before the machinery could destroy them. The statues were carefully excavated, documented, and removed, a process that required the collaboration of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, international conservation specialists, and significant resources. They are now divided between collections in Amman and Washington, where they continue to be studied and where they serve as a reminder that the ancient world is not always somewhere distant and inaccessible. Sometimes it is under a road being built in a modern city, waiting for the moment when someone looks down. The three sites we have visited, Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, and Ain Ghazal, are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a broad and still expanding picture of the pre-pottery Neolithic world, a world that stretched from the Taurus Mountains to the Dead Sea Valley and that persisted, in various forms, for several thousand years. This was not a world in which complexity was rare and surprising. It was a world in which complexity was the norm, expressed in dozens of different ways across dozens of different sites, by communities that shared a fundamental orientation toward the symbolic, the ancestral, and the monumental that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The rate of new discovery in this region is accelerating. Every year, the satellite imagery that covers the landscape of southeastern Anatolia, the Levant, and the surrounding areas is analyzed by researchers looking for the telltale signs of buried structures, the subtle variations in soil color, the slight irregularities in surface topography, the vegetation patterns that mark the outlines of ancient walls and floors. Ground surveys follow the satellite analysis, and excavations follow the ground surveys. The picture is growing faster than researchers can process it, and the picture that is growing is consistently more complex and more surprising than the one that preceded it. What was the world before cities? It was this: a world of stone enclosures on hilltops where animals watched from the walls. A world of houses whose floors contained the dead. A world of plastered faces looking out from the walls of shrines, of statues buried in caches beneath settlements, of towers with staircases that led, perhaps, toward the sky. It was a world that was already asking the questions that cities would later try to answer. Questions about death, about power, about the relationship between the human community and the forces that surrounded and permeated it. The answers it arrived at were different from the answers the cities would later provide. They were not less serious, and they were not less sophisticated. They were earlier, and in some ways they were closer to the bone. The question of what happened to this world, why the pre-pottery Neolithic flourished for several millennia and then gave way to the farming villages and the cities that we more conventionally recognize as the beginning of civilization, is one of the large open questions in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. The transition was not sudden. The pre-pottery Neolithic did not collapse. It transformed, slowly and unevenly, as the populations that had been building temples and burying their dead under their floors began also to cultivate emmer wheat and einkorn, to manage flocks of sheep and goats, to produce pottery, to organize their settlements in new ways. The specific mechanisms of this transformation are debated. Was it driven by climate change, by population pressure, by the logic of increasing social complexity, by the specific feedback loops between ritual gatherings and food production that Klaus Schmidt proposed? Probably all of these, in different proportions at different places and times. What changed most visibly, in the archaeological record, is the character of the symbolic world. The great animal-decorated enclosures of Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites gave way to a different kind of symbolic expression, one more oriented toward domestic fertility, toward the house and the lineage and the productive capacities of the earth, and less toward the wild, the dangerous, the liminal boundary between the human and the animal world. The shift in imagery is also a shift in the kinds of things that mattered, in the cosmological priorities of the people who made the images. This is not a story of progress or of decline. It is a story of transformation, of one kind of world giving way to another. The world before cities was not a simpler world. In many respects, it was doing some of the same things that cities would later do, but organized around different principles, distributed across a landscape rather than concentrated in a single point. When the cities finally came, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, they were not beginnings. They were culminations, the latest development in a long story that started, perhaps, on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, where someone decided that this place was worth building, and began to pull the stone from the ground. And Göbekli Tepe stands at the beginning of that long chain. Not as a finished product, but as the earliest clear signal we have found that the human impulse toward shared meaning, toward building something permanent for reasons that transcend survival, was already fully present. The hilltop in southeastern Anatolia, with its carved circles of stone, is not just a remarkable sight. It is a mirror. We look into it and see ourselves. The transition from the pre-pottery Neolithic to the pottery Neolithic, and from the pottery Neolithic to the early urban civilizations of the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, was not a single event but a series of overlapping transformations that unfolded differently in different places over a period of several thousand years. The Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, emerged from a specific trajectory of agricultural intensification, population growth, and institutional elaboration that built on the earlier Neolithic foundations in specific ways. The writing systems that the Mesopotamian cities developed were genuinely new tools that allowed new kinds of record-keeping and communication. But the social capacity that made those tools useful, the capacity to organize large numbers of people around shared projects, to maintain institutional memory across generations, to build and sustain shared worlds of meaning, was not new. It had been present for thousands of years, visible in the stones of Göbekli Tepe and in the houses of Çatalhöyük and in the plastered skulls of Jericho. The cities did not invent civilization. They scaled it. They concentrated it. They gave it new tools, writing, accounting, monumental architecture of a new kind, specialized bureaucracy, that allowed it to operate at a new order of magnitude. But the underlying capacities were older, deeper, more widely distributed than the urban revolution required or created. The world before cities was not a world of isolated, simple communities waiting for the right conditions to develop into something more complex. It was already complex in the ways that mattered most, symbolically, socially, cognitively. The cities were a crystallization, a moment when a much longer and more distributed process reached a particular point of density and produced something visible enough to leave the kind of record that history has always noticed. Understanding this longer story changes how we think about ourselves. We are not the products of a few thousand years of civilizational development, built on a foundation of primitive animal existence. We are the latest expressions of a social and symbolic capacity that has been operating for tens of thousands of years, that was already producing remarkable things before writing existed to record them, and that will almost certainly continue to operate in ways that we cannot yet imagine after everything we currently call civilization has long since transformed into something unrecognizable. The stones on the hill at Göbekli Tepe are not just evidence of the past. They are evidence of of what we are capable of when we gather together around a shared meaning, when we commit our labor and our ingenuity to building something that goes beyond the practical necessities of survival. There is a concept in archaeology called the Neolithic package, the bundle of innovations typically associated with the transition to farming life. Domesticated plants and animals, permanent settlement, pottery, ground stone tools, and the rest. For a long time, the assumption was that this package arrived more or less together, that the various innovations were linked to each other in ways that made them develop simultaneously or in a fixed sequence. Göbekli Tepe and the other pre-pottery Neolithic sites of southeastern Anatolia complicate this picture significantly, because they show that at least some of the things we associate with settled, complex life, monumental construction, shared symbolic culture, large-scale social organization, preceded the full development of the agricultural package by several thousand years. This suggests that the Neolithic package was not really a package at all, in the sense of a set of innovations that naturally or necessarily go together. It was a set of capabilities and practices that developed at different rates in different places, that were taken up and combined in various ways by different communities over a very long period. The specific combination that we tend to call civilization, agriculture, settlement, monument, writing, was one path through a much larger space of possibilities. It was not the only path available, and the communities that preceded it or developed alongside it were not simply waiting for civilization to arrive. They were already doing something. The sites that are now being found and excavated across the greater Middle East, not just in Turkey but in Jordan, Syria, and Israel, are filling in a picture of extraordinary density and variety. Dozens of pre-pottery Neolithic sites, each with its own architectural character and symbolic vocabulary, each connected to the others by the shared cultural tradition that produced the T-shaped pillar and the carved animal repertoire, together constitute a world whose spatial extent and temporal depth we are only beginning to appreciate. The intellectual history of how Göbekli Tepe has been received by the scholarly community is itself instructive. When Klaus Schmidt first published his findings in the mid-1990s, the initial response from some quarters was skepticism. The date seemed too early, the structures too large and too complex, the implications too disruptive of established models. Over the subsequent 3 decades, as more of the site was excavated and as the dating was confirmed by multiple independent methods, the skepticism largely gave way to acceptance, and then to the more challenging process of revising the theoretical frameworks that the site had challenged. The revision is still ongoing. The models of early human social complexity are being rebuilt, piece by piece, to accommodate evidence that the old models could not explain. This is how science works, slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but ultimately in the direction of the evidence. The broader public response has been different in character. More immediate, more emotional, more inclined toward the dramatic. The site has been claimed by writers across a wide spectrum, from serious popular science writers to proponents of lost civilization theories who see in its precocity evidence for an advanced civilization that preceded the known archaeological record. These more speculative interpretations are not supported by the evidence, but they reflect something real about the emotional resonance of the site. the sense that Göbekli Tepe represents a gap in our self-knowledge, a moment in the human past that we did not know was there, a reminder that the story of our species is longer and stranger than the standard account acknowledges. The scientific response to Göbekli Tepe has been methodologically productive. Archaeologists, geologists, botanists, and zooarchaeologists have all brought their tools to bear on the questions the site raises. Isotopic analysis of human remains found in some of the fill deposits is helping to reconstruct the diet and geographic origins of the people who came to the site. Botanical analysis of plant remains is tracking the early history of cereal cultivation in the region surrounding the site. Remote sensing surveys are identifying additional structures beneath the unexcavated portions of the mound. The site has become a laboratory for collaborative, multidisciplinary archaeology, and the results are steadily enriching the understanding of what Göbekli Tepe was and what it meant in the world that produced it. The full map of this world is not yet drawn. New sites are being identified every year, each one adding another data point to a distribution that is steadily expanding, steadily pushing back the boundaries of what we can say with confidence about the capabilities and the complexity of the human communities that preceded farming. The picture that is emerging is not of isolated pockets of unusual sophistication, but of a broad, long-lasting, geographically extensive cultural tradition that was doing remarkable things in stone long before the word civilization was available to describe them. We are, it turns out, a very old kind of animal. And we have been doing this, building meaning together, in stone and image and shared effort, for much longer than we knew. The skull cult of the pre-pottery Neolithic is one of the most distinctive and most discussed aspects of the symbolic world of this period. At multiple sites across the Levant and Anatolia, Jericho, Ain Ghazal, Catalhoyuk, and several others, archaeologists have found human skulls that have been specially treated, plastered with clay or lime to reconstruct facial features, inlaid with shell or stone to represent eyes, sometimes painted with red or black pigment. These plastered skulls represent what appears to have been a widespread and long-lasting practice of preserving and elaborating the remains of specific dead individuals in a way that kept them visually present within the community long after death. The Jericho plastered skulls, found in the 1950s and dated to approximately 8000 BCE, are among the most famous prehistoric artifacts in the world. They are arresting objects. The reconstruction of facial features in white plaster over the actual bone of the skull creates an effect that is simultaneously realistic and uncanny, lifelike and clearly dead, present and absent in a way that is deeply strange to modern eyes. Looking at them, it is possible to feel something of the specific texture of the relationship between the living and the dead that characterized this world, a relationship in which death did not mean removal but transformation, in which the dead remained part of the community in a physically present, tangible form. Whose skulls were preserved in this way? The evidence suggests that the practice was selective. Not all the dead were treated this way, only certain individuals, presumably those whose relationship to the community made their continued presence particularly significant. They may have been ancestors, leaders, founders, specialists, or possessors of specific knowledge. What is clear is that the people who preserved them wanted to keep something of these specific individuals within the world of the living, and that they used the physical substance of the skull as the medium for doing so. The plastered skulls of the pre-pottery Neolithic are not primitive or crude. They are sophisticated objects, produced with care and skill, reflecting a complex set of beliefs about identity, death, and the relationship between the living and the dead. They are not so different, in their underlying logic, from the relics of saints preserved in medieval churches, or from the photographs of the dead kept on family altars in cultures around the world today. The specific technology is different. The fundamental impulse, to maintain a connection with specific individuals after death through the preservation of a physical trace, is recognizably human. The presence of this shared tradition across a wide area is consistent with the broader picture of a connected cultural world in the pre-pottery Neolithic Near East, a world in which specific practices and specific ideas traveled through networks of exchange and contact that linked communities separated by significant distances. The skull cult is one thread in this network, connecting communities as different as the tower builders of Jericho, the house communities of Catalhoyuk, and the statue makers of Ain Ghazal in a shared set of concerns about death, identity, and the maintenance of relationships across the boundary between the living and the dead. The skull cult connects to one of the broadest and most persistent themes in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, the concern with ancestors and with the management of the relationship between the living and the dead. This concern is not unique to the pre-pottery Neolithic. It appears in various forms throughout the later Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and beyond, and it can be traced through specific continuities of practice and symbolism that link the plastered skulls of Jericho to the funerary rites of much later periods. The specific practices change, but the underlying concern, with honoring the dead, with maintaining their presence in the world of the living, with managing the relationship between generations across the boundary of mortality, is remarkably persistent. It is one of the things about human beings that appears to be very old indeed, present in the archaeological record long before writing gave it explicit articulation, expressed in material practices that speak across the centuries in a language that does not require translation to be understood. The headless figures of Göbekli Tepe, the plastered skulls of Jericho, the ancestors buried beneath the floors of Catalhoyuk, the white plaster faces of Ain Ghazal, these are different expressions of the same fundamental human preoccupation with the dead and with what remains after death. The specific forms are shaped by specific cultural traditions, specific environments, specific historical moments. But the underlying concern is constant, and it was already present, fully formed, long before the first city was built. What does Göbekli Tepe mean for us, here, now, looking back across 12,000 years at the stones on the hilltop? It means, most immediately, that human beings were capable of sustained, organized, symbolically sophisticated collective action before any of the external conditions we normally cite as enabling such action were in place. Before cities, before agriculture, before writing, before political hierarchy in any form we would recognize, people were gathering in large numbers to build spaces for purposes that went beyond practical necessity. They were investing enormous effort in the construction of a shared symbolic world, a world of meaning that was embodied in stone and image and communal practice, maintained across generations, and significant enough to justify the enormous cost of its creation. This tells us something important about human nature that is not often foregrounded in the standard accounts of our origins. We are not primarily economic beings who build symbolic systems as a byproduct of having food security and leisure time. We are, it appears, fundamentally symbolic beings, beings for whom the construction of shared meaning is not a luxury added on top of survival but something closer to a basic drive, a need that operates alongside the needs for food and shelter and safety rather than subordinate to them. Göbekli Tepe is evidence that the symbolic dimension of human life was already operating at scale before the agricultural and economic transformations that we typically credit with enabling it. This reframing matters for more than academic reasons. If the capacity for large-scale social cooperation is not a product of economic development but a precondition for it, if the ability to build shared meaning is what makes the other achievements possible, rather than the other way around, then the study of how human communities construct and maintain shared worlds of meaning is not a marginal or decorative area of inquiry. It is central to understanding how human societies form, survive, and transform. This reframing also changes how we think about the relationship between ritual and civilization. In the conventional account, religion is one of the things that civilization produces. As societies become more complex, they develop more elaborate symbolic systems to justify and sustain their complexity. Göbekli Tepe suggests something more fundamental, that the impulse toward shared ritual practice, toward the construction of dedicated symbolic spaces, toward the marking of a community's relationship to the cosmos in permanent stone, was not produced by civilization but was one of the forces that produced it. The temple was not a product of the city. The city may have been a product of the temple. The people at Göbekli Tepe left us no text to decode, no narrative to follow, no names or dates or genealogies. They left us stones. Shaped stones, carefully placed, decorated with the images of the animals they lived among, arranged in circles on a hilltop that may have been the most important place in the world they knew. The emotional dimension of what this represents is worth sitting with for a moment, here in the quiet. 12,000 years ago, in a landscape that is now dry and stark, people gathered on a hilltop and built something that mattered to them more than almost anything else. They shaped enormous stones with their hands. They moved those stones across the ground with ropes and timber and the organized effort of many bodies working together, and they set those stones in circles that have lasted 12,000 years. They decorated those stones with images of the world they inhabited, the animals they hunted and feared and revered, the creatures that moved at the edges of the human world. They came back, generation after generation, and built more. And then, when the time came, they covered it all with earth and walked away. What they believed, in all its specificity, is gone. But the stones remain. And the stones tell us that they believed in something, and that they were willing to build a mountain for it. The impulse to build something that outlasts you, to leave a mark in stone, to arrange the world in a pattern that carries meaning beyond the individual life, is one of the most human impulses there is. Göbekli Tepe is not the last expression of this impulse. It may be the earliest we can still see. The stone circles of the British Isles, the pyramids of Egypt and the Americas, the cathedrals of medieval Europe, the great mosques and temples and monuments of every culture that has ever existed, all of them are expressions of the same fundamental human need, to build together, in materials that endure, around a shared sense of what matters. Göbekli Tepe did not create this need. It simply shows us how old it is. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe is far from complete. Only a fraction of the site has been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed additional enclosures beneath the unexcavated portions of the mound, perhaps 16 more enclosures in addition to the handful that have been exposed. The site may be significantly larger and significantly more complex than what is currently visible. Each new season of excavation produces new evidence that refines and sometimes revises the existing picture. The work is slow, careful, and expensive. Archaeological excavation at this scale takes decades and requires sustained funding, sustained expertise, and sustained institutional commitment. The Turkish government has invested significantly in the site, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Property and a major draw for visitors and scholars alike. Today, when the archaeologists move through the site with their brushes and their notebooks, cleaning reliefs that have been in darkness for thousands of years, there is a quality of patience to the work that mirrors the patience of the stones themselves. A carved fox emerges from the soil one careful stroke at a time. A vulture's wing takes shape over an afternoon. The detail was always there. The light is new. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, at 60 years old, before the full implications of what he had found were worked out. But the work continues. The collaboration between Turkish institutions and international research teams that has characterized the excavation continues to deepen the understanding of what Göbekli Tepe was and what it meant in the world that produced it. Each season adds to the picture he began to draw on that first day, when he looked at what the shepherd had found and understood that this was something entirely new. What will future excavations reveal? Almost certainly, more enclosures. Possibly, evidence of structures or activities that the currently excavated areas have not yet revealed. Perhaps something that casts new light on the specific purposes of the site and the specific people who built it. The site has been known to the modern world for 30 years, and it has already changed the way archaeologists think about the origins of complex human society. The pace of discovery at Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding Taz Tepeler sites suggests that the changes are far from over. The people at Göbekli Tepe left us no text to decode, no narrative to follow, no names or dates. They left us stones. And then, when the time came, they covered it all with earth and walked away, leaving the stones for someone else to find, in a future they could not have imagined, in a language they did not know was coming. The stones have been waiting 12,000 years. They are in no hurry. The scientific response to Göbekli Tepe has been methodologically diverse. Archaeologists, physical anthropologists, geologists, botanists, zooarchaeologists, isotope geochemists, and remote sensing specialists have all brought their tools to bear on the questions the site raises. Isotopic analysis of human remains found in some of the fill deposits is helping reconstruct the diet and geographic origins of the people who came to the site. Botanical analysis of plant remains is tracking the early history of cereal cultivation in the surrounding region. The site has become a laboratory for the collaborative, multidisciplinary archaeology that is increasingly the norm for major ancient sites, and the results are steadily enriching the understanding of what Göbekli Tepe was and what it meant in the world that produced it. In the end, Göbekli Tepe is a place where the human story looks different. Not shorter, but longer. Not simpler, but more complicated. Not more certain, but more interesting. The stones on the hilltop do not tell us that we are wrong about where we came from. They tell us that the story goes further back than we knew, and that the further back it goes, the more we recognize in it. The gathering, the building, the caring about the invisible things, the making of meaning in stone and image and shared effort. 12,000 years ago. Before cities. Before writing. Before almost everything we use to define the word civilization. Someone was already doing this. Someone was already here. And we are the continuation of what they started. The cities, the writing, the empires, the sciences, the arts, all of it grew from the same root that produced the circles of stone on the plateau. The root is the human capacity for shared meaning, the ability to gather around a common purpose and build something that transcends the individual and the moment. Göbekli Tepe did not create that capacity. It is one of the earliest places where we can still see it at work, visible in the stone it left behind. The story that began on that hilltop is still going. We are inside it. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.